welcome to this very special Adelaide Fringe Professional Development session called Consideration Edinburgh. My name is Andy Beecroft. I'm the Marketplace Manager for Adelaide Fringe's International Marketplace Honeypot. I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining you today from the lands of the Kaurna people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. The title of this session, as I say, is Consideration Edinburgh. So we wanted to give you kind of some contextual pointers in terms of what you might like to think about when taking your work over to Edinburgh. And there's lots of resources that are available to artists. There's a great resource called the Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society in Edinburgh, and they have an amazing team there who are really sort of ready and engaged to kind of really answer any questions, and they have resources themselves on their Fringe Connect model, as well as the resources in the team we have here. But I think it's really good and really useful to sort of kind of hear from three great speakers who have got their own experience and have been to Edinburgh themselves on numerous occasions under different guises. So I'm really, really pleased to be able to welcome you today, three great speakers. We've got Bronwyn Batten. So Bronwyn Batten is an award-winning Australian theatre artist with over 10 years of experience of writing, producing and performing her own work nationally and internationally. And Bron's work has travelled all around the world and been presented at prestigious venues and festivals such as the Soho Theatre in London, La Puta Calais in Paris, Dark Mofo in Tasmania, the Melbourne Theatre Company, the Malthouse Theatre, the Performance Space in Sydney, Vital Statistics in South Australia, as well as Adelaide Fringe and others as well to boot. Bron won the Summerhall Edinburgh Fringe Touring Award in 2019 and took Waterloo to Summerhall in 2022 for the season.
That's
We're
right.
also joined by Deb Wilkes, Director of Cluster Arts. Deb is well known in the Australian circus scene. Her dedication to the performing arts has seen her working in the field for over 20 years and has definitely been a driving force in the Australian circus. She's worked with many emerging and established artists and has a passion for improving the business skills of artists and building the value of arts to non-artists, which has led to the formation of Cluster Arts. And Cluster Arts itself is a global conduit for Australian artists in circus and physical theatre. They advocate and elevate artists' work. And in 2022, Cluster Arts took a staggering 10 shows to the Edinburgh Fringe for the season, with 57 artists that were taking part in those 10 shows. And finally, we've got Richard Jordan, a London-based Olivier and Tony award-winning producer. Richard is the producer with Richard Jordan Productions and has commissioned and produced over 250 productions around the world, including 80 world premieres, and has produced and collaborated with many of the world's leading theatres. He's also an international producing partner at the Merigong Theatre Company in Australia and the Chicago Shakespeare Theatre. And Richard also writes a weekly online column for the Stage newspaper and has been going to Edinburgh since 1987. So yeah, I guess they all bring a rich tapestry of experiences and stories from Edinburgh. And we'll dig deeper into those as we go along today. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe we'll just go around the room quickly, just if there's anything else you want to add about who you are and your affiliation with Edinburgh. Maybe we'll start with you, Bron.
Yeah, I'm here on Wurundjeri and Boomerang Land here tonight in Naarm in Melbourne. And I've been to Edinburgh 3 times. So I've done shows at Gilded Balloon, Underbelly, Cowgate and Summerhall was the last one that I've done. And these have all been solo works presented at the festival. So that's my perspective and experience of Edinburgh.
Great. Thanks, Bron. And yourself, Deb?
I'm in Meanjin at the moment, Brisbane, on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. My first Edinburgh was 2017, when I went along kind of on a little bit of an expedition to have a suss it all out. But one of our clients, Casa Circus, was performing there as well. So that was kind of my first Edinburgh, and I've been there each year since then. Obviously not through COVID, but yeah.
So thanks, Deb. And Richard, finally, anything else that you might want to add?
No, I mean, as Andy said, I was about 12 years old when I first came to Edinburgh in 1987, and I've been coming every year since. And then, as I say, when I started in the theatre at 16, I came up then as a stage manager, and then I started producing, and in 1999 did my first show in Edinburgh. So in many ways, Edinburgh gave me my career. So it's a very sort of special place to keep coming back to and watch how it's evolved and how it's changed over the years, and still its real importance in the whole theatre ecology globally.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good starting point, really. I mean, in terms of contextualizing Edinburgh Fringe and the festival, it is obviously the world's biggest arts festival, and it is, I guess, an event which attracts thousands and thousands of people each year to make that pilgrimage to a city and a festival which for some is a goal to achieve many varying different degrees of goals and aspirations. I mean, to give it some sort of context in terms of its size and its depth, I mean, as I say, it's the largest open access festival in the world. Last year in 2022, off the back of COVID, they sold 2.2 million tickets. There were 3,646 shows that were performed from 63 countries there last year, and that's a slight increase on obviously the COVID years. But prior to that, they were presenting over 4,500 shows at some times. To give you an idea of the number of artists and performances, there's over 53,000 performances across the festival for the whole 3 weeks. So it really is, it becomes a huge, I guess, 24-hour festival hub and site, which attracts not only the shows and companies that present there, but also a rich tapestry of industry, spectators and tourists. So it really is, I guess, in terms of its numbers, a behemoth of a festival, which lends itself to the sort of challenging and difficult nature that sort of you're faced in terms of those numbers alone. But people do go back year in, year out, or they come, they present for the first time because they have a reason to do so. So I guess it'd be nice to sort of hear from each of you sort of what you can tell me about your first Edinburgh Fringe and what attracted you to the city and the festival. Brom, I might start with you, please.
I first performed there in 2016, but I first went as a punter in 2006. And that's sort of the advice I give to lots of artists who ask me if it's possible, if you can, to go as a punter before you take a show there. You might decide that it's not for you, and that you see the size and kind of overwhelming environment and sort of decide not to go, and that's having that experience first is a good way. I went in 2010, and then I went, I think, another year after that before doing the show in 2016. And it really is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Like, it is, being a month in Edinburgh, it is stunning. And I suppose that's kind of when I think about Edinburgh, I just think about standing in front of the Marks and Spencers on Princess Street at twilight and looking up at the castle and just being like, holy shit, like, this is such a stunning place. So it really is a kind of dramatic, no pun intended, setting for this festival, for sure.
Yeah.
I agree completely. I think I can still, I think I've said it in my email to you guys, that I still remember standing there just looking at the steeples and the cobblestones and just being blown away by the beauty and the age of everything in Edinburgh. It was just fabulous, and I've never ever forgotten that. And every time I go back there, I still take a deep breath, and as I see the gorgeous buildings, and it's just spectacular, absolutely spectacular. Yeah.
I think it's you know, I think the great thing is if you come to Edinburgh, you become part of a legacy, because obviously you're following the footsteps of all those shows and the foundation of why the Fringe first started with a group of 6 artists who came up to try and sort of create a Fringe beside the international festival as a response to not being invited in the in the first international festival that was happening, and thus the Fringe was born. And I think it you know, as Bron and Debbie were both saying, it is a truly fantastic place to come to. It's a lovely place to spend 4 weeks of your life. When you hear Andy's statistics, it's also absolutely terrifying, because, you know, I think with producing, sometimes if you think too much about it, you absolutely scare yourself and you never end up producing a show. And in a way, when you hear those numbers, you do also realize the challenges. So I'd count it also as saying, as well as being the most wonderful place, if it's going well for you, there's nowhere better. If it's not going so great, it can be one of the hardest places and environments to produce a show on the planet, and it can be a very lonely place. Producing can be a very lonely life at times, because you carry a lot of things, and I think in Edinburgh, its size makes its challenges much harder, because you're dealing with an environment that isn't akin to really producing it anywhere else in the same way. So you do have to come quite, you know, prepared for that. And I think the point that Bron made, if you can come up before, you know, coming to play at the Fringe and see if it's the environment for you, because not every show has to go to the Edinburgh Fringe. There's lots of other places out there, and placement is as important as finding sometimes the right show to put on and take. I think it really can help you, because it will give you a little bit of the lay of the land of the knowledge, what the venues are like, because all these venues have a different feel, just like they do at Adelaide. And placing those things really properly, and knowledge in theatre is power anyway. I think if you can make that trip, it can be an incredibly valuable thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely great place to start in terms of considering not just Edinburgh, but any festival or any Fringe. I think having that ability and resource to actually go to the festival beforehand, yes, it can, you know, that's not obviously an option open to everyone, but it can be very, very important to sort of see how each individual festival or Fringe operates, because they are all different. I mean, you know, in terms of Edinburgh, it's obviously the oldest Fringe festival, you know, established in 1947. Adelaide Fringe, you know, established in 1960, still very old, but you know, we've seen Fringe festivals and events, you know, really sort of bloom and blossom over you know, a number of years now, you know, to the point where, you know, the World Fringe recognizes over 300 fringes around the world. So, you know, each one brings their own individuality and challenge, and, you know, not knowing the landscape or the venues or where your work fits before, and landing there fresh, you know, it brings about a challenge in itself. So, yeah, I think that's a very good starting point in terms of considering anything.
I just add though, Andy, if you can't actually get to the Fringe to do a recce year, there you can ask people, you can talk to people who have been there before, other artists, producers, presenters that you might know, or you can look online to a lot of the information. I mean, it doesn't give you the sense of the size of it, I know that, but I think sometimes people forget to just ask people they know who've been there, and you don't want just the horror stories, because there are good stories as well. So it's good to get some kind of, you know, balance, I suppose. Yeah,
definitely use the resources to hand. You know, your contacts, your friends, people that have performed there before. I think that's also really good to get the honest opinion, and, you know, they know you, or they might not know you, but they know of your work potentially, or the types of work you're bringing, and they can definitely, you know, bring about a constructive kind of informational sort of resource, you know, to your planning there, really. I mean, what would you say the main differences between Edinburgh and like a Fringe like Adelaide or any other fringes, do you think? Richard, what's your opinion on the
I mean, look, I think there's actually a lot of similarities and commonalities to actually both of them. I mean, obviously the enormity of size is a very big difference. So, I mean, you are, you know, dealing with a much bigger marketplace. And I suppose everything always has to start when you do a show, whatever it is, about the why. Why am I doing this? What's the reason? What's the goal and the objective that I'm looking at trying to bring? And why am I doing this? And then thinking about, okay, why is Edinburgh going to be the right place for that? And there's many reasons. One might be, look, it's on my bucket list. I've always wanted to play the Edinburgh Fringe. I just want to have that experience of doing it. I'm a company. I want to come and see if I can engender some further onward opportunities. I'm an actor. I'm wanting to bring work because this might be able to be somewhere that I can get exposure. I'm a stand-up comedian, and I know that in Edinburgh, there are a number of significant awards. There's a lot of television scouts and people, there's lots of reasons within that. And also there's the other one about development of work, which in a way has sort of fallen down the path a little bit, because Edinburgh, like a lot of things, has turned into a lot of showcases. But actually the development and the early seeds of that is really, really important also, because you can put on a show as you can in Adelaide in front of 30 or 40 different days of Adelaide's a bit longer than Edinburgh, of different audiences, and actually get some of the most honest reactions of the work you're coming out. So I think with fringes, there's a really important thing about growth, but you have to also think often that a fringe is the start of the journey, not the end of it. And I think there's a lot of a habit now in a lot of fringes globally sometimes to just abandon stuff at the end because maybe you didn't get the reviews you were hoping for, wasn't starting. And actually, often at the end of a fringe, I often think it's when the real work really starts. So actually, I think there is, a lot of close connection with. I'm a patron of the Brighton Fringe, and I think there's a lot of commonality with Adelaide and Edinburgh when I come to those. So I think the one difference is obviously Adelaide sometimes does shorter hops of runs, so it's maybe not there for the whole fringe. Whereas I would say to anyone, if they can come to Edinburgh, think about coming for the entire duration of it, because I think it actually helps you to establish. I think it helps you with media and press being able to get into that. But I think you'll find there's a lot of similarities. I mean, obviously the challenges of get in and get out are no different. So you're dealing with a lot of venues where you've got 20 minutes or 30 minutes to get your show in. So those are really important factors to think about what you're choosing to bring, and obviously to bring your best work. I've had people who've sometimes come to me and said, oh, I brought this show to Edinburgh because I thought it was the easiest show to bring, but it's not my best work. If you're coming from overseas or you're coming from somewhere else. And I would say, if you can do it, if it's not your best work, don't come yet. Wait, or maybe skip a year, raise some more money, and bring the work that you think is going to show you the best. Because actually, Edinburgh can serve as a calling card. So great success in Edinburgh, it can take you off elsewhere. But it's really important for all that front end investment and all those challenges to make sure that you give yourself the best opportunity that you possibly can. So as Deb was saying, going out and talking to people and getting that knowledge, finding out how other people's experiences were, how the aesthetics of the venues work. And that in Adelaide, there's different vibes. If you do a show in Gluttony, it's going to feel different to if you're doing a show at Holden Street. But all those venues have a different kind of sense of feel, and that can actually hug your show and embrace it in a really important way. So, taking that time to do that research, it really can behoove you.
I would say that point about scale is a really important one, and that we were talking before the recording on. Richard was saying the evolution into the comedy side of the festival, which is so huge, has also pushed back the kind of production support that a lot of venues can give to shows. So I've taken predominantly theatre productions that have cues and lights and video and sound. And so that kind of work is very different to a stand-up who walks out to a microphone and can get in 2 minutes. And you're saying 20 to 30 minutes. What venues are those? Because I haven't heard of anyone. I was at Summer Hall last year and my get-in was 15 minutes. So and then the cleanup as well. So all of those things. And often people make work for those contexts, but they are important considerations because they can really impact, of course, how you put the show up and take the show down, and what your experience is. Running around screaming in barefoot trying to gather up, a whole stage full of ping pong balls in 7 minutes day after day is not the funnest thing to do. So, these are all things to think about.
Yeah.
I think to answer your question, it depends on the negotiation. I mean, I was very fortunate that we had a show that was really big, and I had a 1 hour get it in. But the reason behind that was that the venue particularly wanted that show, but the way we had to make it work was we had to be the first show of the day. Yeah. So sometimes if you've got something, it doesn't preclude necessarily what you're doing. It's just sometimes you've got to think, you know, quite naturally about that. And as you were saying, you know, if your show normally takes a couple of hours to get in and you've got to get the whole thing in 15 minutes, you have to start to, it's very easy to get into, not with every show, but it's very easy to get very tunnel vision when you produce and convince yourself everything's going to be okay. And actually, sometimes you realize at the end that hindsight can be a wonderful thing. And you can say, actually, you know, I tried to make a square pin fit in a round plug, and actually I needed an hour and a half to get this show, and then I thought it would be okay in 15 minutes, and it becomes a disaster. So in a sense, you really have to think about Edinburgh almost as its own entity, as a touring entity. So if you've got to adapt your production or change it, what concessions have I got to make to that? If you're doing someone's play, it's a really important point to think that it's not your own work, because if you've bought the rights to put a play on, it may not be that you can cut out 15 minutes of that playwright's play because you've got to fit a 1 hour slot when normally the play's 1 hour 20 minutes. So those are really important things to also be considering if you are talking to agents or different people that are giving you permission to do the work, and actually just looking at the aesthetics. So really you come and you get the best experience of making that work. But it's the same as Adelaide and the same as any other fringe. If you've got a particular timed window, to just think about those things, so you really shape the show to the environment in which you're playing. And I would always say, if you can with Edinburgh, to do a warm-up before you come to Edinburgh. So for example, you know, and Bron, you had the great experience of playing other places before you came to Summerhall with your show. So it means that in a way you can put the setup somewhere. You can actually test run those get-ins and those get-outs, because it's actually all quite a military operation as to how sometimes you've got to do it. And suddenly you realize those challenges of how you address things. And suddenly in a 4-hour technical rehearsal, when you're there and the next time you're going to be doing it is the show for real, that those things become actual challenges. And actually, if you're an artist performing and you're doing it all yourself, they can be real additional challenges that mentally can really affect actually how good the show is going to be at first, because you're thinking about all that stuff at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to go back to the why briefly before we sort of talk about venues, because I think that's a good sort of starting point, really. I think everyone's got a different why, but having a why and knowing your reasons, because there might be different reasons for going to Edinburgh. It might be to get reviews, it might be to test new work, it might be to find a new audience or touring opportunities, or or it might be part of a holiday that you think it'd be fun to tack on a show, you know, because I've never done Edinburgh, like a bucket list thing. But everyone, I think, having an understanding of the why is probably key to, really interrogating, considering something like Edinburgh. So I mean, like for yourself, Deb, you know, obviously producing and looking after, you know, a roster of 10 shows last year, for example, but, you know, prior to that would have been less shows, you know, been fluctuations over the years. But, well, I know it's a big question, but like, what's sort of a professional why for you and Cluster Arts in terms of taking work to Edinburgh when you take work all around anyway?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and one that we always ask every artist that comes to us and wants to go to Edinburgh. We do a number of things for artists, and that is go through that reason. Why are you going? And once we understand that, we can also bring it back to that when we're in Edinburgh to remind artists of why we're there, especially as Richard said before, where things may not go as well as you think, or your ticket sales aren't where you want them to be. But that was never the primary reason for being there. So what was the primary reason for being there? And it is about reviews. It's about putting yourself on the world stage. It's a benchmark for some people. Was with a company last year who got a 3-star review and practically fell over. It was devastated with this 3-star review. And it was the first time they'd been on the world stage, if you want to put it that way. And so they were getting, and we all know reviews are, they're not the be all and end all and or anything like that, but it was devastating for him. But then he learned about himself, and he also learned that this, if he wanted to be an artist and do what he was doing, then maybe he needed to make some changes. So it was a good thing, even though it was really difficult. But to be honest, I'm glad that we were with him, because I think on your own as an artist, to find that out about yourself, that's a really hard thing to do on your own. Other artists go to find touring and presenters, partners, which we try and help negotiate and trawling through the people that are coming to Edinburgh to find out the presenters or venues or festivals that are looking for partnerships with artists and really wanting to develop relationships. So the why is really crucial, actually, to why you're there. And you need to understand that about what it is that you're wanting to achieve, so that you understand as things go on through the month where you're at, and are you actually achieving what you wanted to do?
Yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah.
And how about you, Brian, as a solo performer who's been 3 times? What's been your, I guess, professional why as to going for those 3 times?
I suppose essentially I'm kind of a masochist, I think. I was going to say, gosh, 3 stars. That, imagine if it was 2. Goodness. The first time I went, I was invited by Gilded Balloon. Karen Corrin, who's the long-standing AD of Gilded, saw a show I did with my dad in New Zealand and invited us to go, and that felt really exciting and really thrilling that this kind of producer wanted to sort of transfer the work. What happened after was one of those horror stories that Deb was talking about, but that kind of, and I think in Australia you reach a point where you do want to kind of push out, and you might have presented work around Australia and you're thinking sort of what's next, and it can be a new kind of context for the work. At Underbelly in 2018, it was through a season I did at Soho, and then I got an introduction. I got an into the venue through Burke's Nest Comedy in London, did an intro, which was really lovely of them. So that's how I got the venue. And that was a very different experience because I had been before, and I really kept myself in check during that season and really kept everything in perspective, and was like, if I had 15 people and I was like, holy shit, 15 people, this is amazing. The average audience across Edinburgh is 2 people. So I was like, 15 people came to my show, and really, really worked so hard on keeping that mental perspective and holding that for myself. I had friends who were cancelling shows where you play to 1 or 2 people, and the lowest I think I did was 12 and the highest was 120. So I was like, this is Edinburgh, like that is unheard of, and really kind of congratulating myself about that. And then Summer Hall was in between, and there were other things going on and working across venues, they're always really different. So I think working out what you're happy with, whether it's 12 people or we did a great show to 9 people last year. It was one of my favorite shows, and it just being prepared for that's going to happen. So how are you going to feel when it happens, and what are you going to do? Are you going to throw the show because there's only 5 people there? You can't. 5 people came, that's double the average. So you really have to pick yourself up and do it. And that kind of resilience, you need it.
And Richard, what about
I
yourself?
was going to just pick up, because I was going to say, I think that's a really good point that Bron makes about the number of people in the room. The thing about it is you never know who maybe those 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people might be that end up in a room, which is why also the show always needs to be as good whether you're playing to 2 people or you're playing to 150 people or 300 people.
The 9 day, that was Sally Cowling, who's the AD of Brighton Festival, and we had a conversation afterwards. She's like, I've been recommending your show to other people, and so it was, like you say, you never know that one of those 9 people is an AD of a national festival. So you can't, you have to do the show, like you say.
I mean, you hear tragic stories, and I think the one you hit, Bron, about the number of people. I think that statistic is also one where there's sort of the average is I think it was 2 or 3 just before COVID. It was 3 people a performance. So if there were 5 shows going on at the same time and one had 15 people in it, then there were 4 shows playing to absolutely no one. It was like an absolute terrible. And I can remember some years ago, this was probably 10 years ago, being in the Edinburgh Fringe, going to see a show on the Royal Mile in a small venue and turning up and the guy at the door saying, "Oh, thank you, I'm glad you've come. You're the first person we've had in the audience for 3 days." And I said, "You don't have to do the show." And he said, "No, please, can we do it?" And I sat down, and there were 15 people in the cast. And so the sitting there, the sound of one set of hands clapping at the end is a pretty, it's a memory I've never completely forgotten. But I did go out then and recommend that show to quite a few other people, because you do feel there is a fringe spirit. You know, there is a thing about everyone trying to help each other. You know, it helps the ecology. You want to see people coming out and succeeding. I mean, my background predominantly as a producer is I'm an artistic producer, so I develop work and I do a lot of dramaturgy of new plays. And so Edinburgh is very valuable to me for coming up and testing work. And obviously within that, we hope that we might also see some onward life to some of that work that goes up internationally. But I think you do have to have a strategy of what that goal is or what you hope to achieve. And maybe there's the dream, and then there's also the sort of realistic situation about what might be achievable. You know, if you aim for the heavens, you might reach the stars, in a sense. But you've also got to have that other thing where you protect you if it doesn't necessarily work. If you perhaps get that 2-star or that 1-star review, how you look after yourself within that, because it also can be very tough if you've got the show next to you that's sold out every performance, and you're coming in and you've just got 2 or 3 people rolling in, and it can become very demoralizing. And you can actually sometimes really knock your confidence in that. And confidence is particularly coming out of COVID, because everyone's taken quite a bad knock with confidence at different times. And so the rebuild of confidence is a really important thing. And I think fringes sometimes can be, because of their volume and their speed and their nature, not easy places to sometimes shred confidence. So it's really important, I think, to surround yourself with friends. If you're a solo artist coming over, I think there's also the importance, if there's a friend of yours who can come, or at least some people who can come and visit you during the fringe, even if you're a producer in the same way. So you've just got people that are sort of allies and friends, and if they come, you know, there's perhaps saying to them, "Well, you've got to do some flyering for me, you've got to help me with this." So it's not just you doing it, because a fringe is a marathon, not a sprint. And in a sense, the way you pace yourself through it is really important, because that show has got to be as good on the last day as it is on the first day. And you've really got to protect yourself like an athlete, to condition yourself to get through that journey, because it is a long journey. And if you've done it, well done, you've survived, congratulations at the end. But you hopefully also have that takeaway at the end that will allow you at that next step of the journey, which, as I said, the fringe is the beginning of a journey, not the end of it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of external things to consider outside of just putting your show up. You know, there's, you know, the marketing, eating, travel, housing. It all adds to the pressure of being in Edinburgh. And I suppose, you know, going back to the discussion about venues, which I think is really interesting in terms of Edinburgh, because Edinburgh is a very different city in terms of how its venues operate and the types of venues that they have available. It's a city that's you know, a UNESCO heritage city that's you know, utilizes caverns and basements. You know, it utilizes parklands and tents. It utilizes small pub rooms. You know, the types of venues and the diversity of venues and the inaccessibility of venues sometimes can be like staggering, and people don't necessarily understand or consider like how important getting the venue and managing the venue in your relationship with the venue is. And I wonder whether you three might be able to talk about, you know, what you think might be the key to getting a good venue and a time, and working with the teams there, like what sorts of things to consider. And that might not be your own experience. It might be from, you know, understanding other people's experiences as well, if you've, you know, had a venue that sort of works okay for you. Ron, I feel like you've got.
Yeah, like I said before, it's about scale. So of course, what kind of show you have and what your tech requirements are might dictate you can only play in these sorts of rooms. So that's going to influence what you're presenting in. Yeah, I made some notes about it. I think, you know, size and time slot, tech requirements, though any time slot can also work. One of the greatest shows I saw, Are We Not Drawn Onward to New Era, which is a Belgian on tour and go and show it at 11 a.m. at Zoo venues, and it was sold out for the entire run. So that was like people were going at 11 a.m. to see a show. You know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, you might pick up people going after lunch, and obviously the 7:30s and the 7 to the 9s or whatever, but you're also competing against people who are on the telly and people who have big followings. So the other time slots might suit you better, or, sort of scoop up some of those other audiences. And again, with venue, if you've been before, that's going to help as well if you've been to the venue. But they all have tech specs and photos and rig lists. They've got all of the stuff that you can look at online, or talk to someone who's performed at the venue before that you're thinking about. There are lots of ways to kind of educate yourself about what the options are for you.
Deb,
Yeah.
you've obviously.
I'm glad you like. I was going to say, I'm glad you like Ron Are We Drawn Onwards to New Era, because I was involved in producing that.
Well,
And that was the show I was using as the example of why we needed to have the morning slot, because if you saw, it was quite a big show, so the get-in of that was quite significant. We couldn't do that in 15 minutes.
Yeah, it was a beautiful show, and I'm talking about great Edinburgh experiences. That's definitely one. So yeah, but of course that has machinations and producing partners as well that can help it have that kind of scale and impact at 11 a.m. So also, if you're an independent artist or going alone, that's going to also change the way that you can operate.
I actually think if you look at venues like the Travis and a lot of those venues, the best selling times, and this is a big difference to Adelaide, is actually doing shows in the morning. Often you're fighting sometimes just against children's shows, and actually if you're thinking about press and journalists, because people sometimes will say doing a show at 10:30 in the morning, that sounds crazy, but you've got a lot of journalists who have nothing to see at that particular time. So if you are a little bit of a less well-known company or a new artist, sometimes they can just squeeze it into their schedule and being in the thicket of the shows. And I for years have always done morning shows as my preference with doing stuff. I also like it the rest of the day off, but it's in a sense that it's I looked at the Travis and looked at who got the highest number of turnover of shows at certain times of the day, and the Travis at 11 o'clock in the morning was generally in its whole spectrum its best selling time, and it's a model I've used with stuff I've done at Summer Hall and other places. So I think it's don't just feel, because I think, as I say, Adelaide is more akin to sometimes doing shows in the evenings and late afternoons. Don't necessarily think that because they're being offered a morning slot, it might not be the best time to come in and do that show. And so
I think also if you're talking about plays or narrative works or sort of more theatrical works, maybe the mornings work better. You might scoop up an early matinee crowd in that way. But if you've got a work that perhaps is more experimental or is a cabaret work or a circus work, Deb, maybe those morning, how does it go in the morning?
They're not so popular in the morning. Kids shows are, but we're kind of locked into venues that have rigging, which is quite limited. It was surprising to find out there's a lot of places don't have rigging that you need, or very limited rigging. And so but mostly, like, often circus is late afternoon or late night, depending on the type of circus that it is, and that seems to sell pretty well. And even the 3:15 slot is really good as well. So that's a very different thing to Australia. I think when we were first there and were given a 3:15, 3:45 slot, we're thinking, oh my goodness, they must think we're terrible to put us on at this time of the day. But of course, as Andy said before, people make a pilgrimage to Edinburgh. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of people there. So it worked. Yeah,
that's interesting to know about the sort of rigging for high scale productions, circus obviously needing specific venues. I didn't know it was quite so limited. I knew obviously the infrastructure of Edinburgh can be quite small and restrictive in certain parts. So does that pose a challenge for the numbers of presentations that you think about each year?
Absolutely, yes, it does, and the type of circus that they do. So the circus hub has rigging. They've got a couple of tents up there, and then some rigging in Underbelly's spaces up around the garden area. And Assembly have rigging in the Palais and one rigging point in the Piccolo, and then we can, depending on what it is, rig in the Roxy. In Central. So, but that's about it. And so that, and a checkpoint, there's one rigging point as well.
Mhm.
So they're just limited, and it's in the middle of the room, and you've got to sort of work around where it is. Because the checkpoint, there's a stage that doesn't quite match up with the rigging point. So you just have to adapt that, and make it work.
So considering the scales and type of work is really important when thinking about Edinburgh. Obviously, you know, Waterloo, like yourself said, Bron, you know, having that turnaround where you've got to clean up hundreds of ping pong balls and, you know, reset the stage for the quick turnarounds of 20 minutes is something, you know, you need to really think about in terms of like the numbers of people coming in and out of the venues each day.
Yeah.
I guess audiences
I was just going to say one thing, Andy, just about placement, which to say, because I think Bron and Debbie made a really good point about time that I was talking about as well, is also I think the vibe of when you think your play will work in that time. And you know, you're absolutely right. There's circus, cabaret, there's a, you know, it's not going to necessarily work at 10 o'clock in the morning. But sometimes if you've got a play where it's got perhaps quite a dense, heavy text, you sometimes want an audience to be quite up for that in the morning. So if they've seen 4 shows before they get in and they've perhaps had lunch or something as well, and they're starting to find that the afternoon is dragging for them a little bit, or they're a bit tired, it can really affect the whole environment of something. And I was going to say about placement and looking at the rooms and looking at the specs of the rooms. And if you can see some pictures of that, because the whole feel of how you feel sometimes when you walk into a space, that very environment when you first walk into it, can really affect the whole rhythm of how that show is going to work for you and how it's going to feel for you when you come to take your seat. And even in like in a tent, if you're a presenter, and I don't know, the first time you have that experience, you're sitting in a Spiegel tent, you kind of always remember it as a Spiegel tent show. But actually, maybe it's very important that if it's been made for a black box, to also feel that those things can move in certain ways, because sometimes people can get very boxed into their placement then of programming vision. And you can sometimes close off a lot of opportunities because then they can only see it one way. So it's really important to make sure that, you know, you make it clear that you can present in as many different ways as possible, or you really place that show in the way that it can best serve it. And as I say, the whole environment of when you come into the venue, how accessible is the box office to the tickets? Bearing in mind you might be selling a lot of tickets at the last minute. Are people running through? Is the venue easy to find? Does all of that carry me through into getting my show and into the environment of the show, so it's going to really play really well when that audience sits down to watch you?
That's a good point, Richard, that I've seen quite a number of shows go into Edinburgh, circus shows, where the artists have been quite set in this is the way it is presented. And then because of there's not that availability, or they've had to change, or they've had to adapt, that's actually been a really good thing for them. And so they have found, because they do have to open their minds to think, well, maybe this front on isn't going to work all the time, but how would it go in a Spiegel tent or whatever? And then we have to get more tech specs made up to sort of suit the change. And that just opens opportunity for them. So that's, I think, a really good thing.
Yeah. I think if you're talking about adaptability versus compromise and how those two things sit together, obviously you still want it to be the best that it can be and not to have to make too many kind of concessions about stuff.
Totally.
And Fringe is all about being nimble. That's a big skill to doing a show at the Fringe, I think. Which
can be a challenge to your artistic practice if you're not used to having those restrictions or working in that environment. I guess that's can be really challenging in itself to your practice.
I think last year, was really challenging because the first year back after COVID, there was a real lack of technical staff and people that had been to the Fringe before. So we had like front of house staff were very, very inexperienced. And so that kind of made it even more challenging last year in 2022, just having that change, I suppose, after COVID. But from what I understand, it's back, or going to be back to much more how it used to be. And a lot of the experienced people are back on board. So kind of hoping that's what will happen this year.
And I think it can be tough if you get to say one of these venues and perhaps it's not quite as you expected, or the specs not quite as you expected, because then you've got a choice. What do? Do you do the show and do you pack it, or do you pack up and say, stuff it, I'm going home? And nobody's going to necessarily turn around and do that. But it's where, again, I think particularly, and it's really tough if you're a solo artist, if you haven't got necessarily the same support around you in that way, or you're trying to therefore have to make what may be a concession or a compromise to your show, you haven't got always that eye that's looking at you of what you're doing outside of what you're doing inside the space. And so, as I say, if you've got an ally who can travel with you, or someone who can really help you and things like that, it can really, I think, help you with the journey of the show and just dealing with the stresses of it. I'd imagine with someone like yourself, Bron, with touring and doing solo work.
Yeah, and I would say that's a good point about technical support too, Deb, because your technician, particularly, you know, if you're a solo work or you have a small ensemble, becomes the other, you know, the other collaborator with you, and they could really make or break the show. And having that relationship, having a great operator can really just make, you know, is another thing that can make or break the season. So I think, you know, like you say, having an ally, Richard, but also if you can afford to tour with a tech, that can take a lot of stress and a lot of worry about, am I going to get to the venue and have someone who's never seen a sound desk before? And, you know, that adds just another level of panic to an already quite intense situation. So, you know, do they know how to use QLab? Do they know, you know, so yeah, if you can tour a tech, that would be another plus, I would say.
On that note, can I give a quick little Edinburgh nugget, which I just think is really important if people are going this year, about their technical rehearsals, which is that often when you're doing a venue tech, you perhaps have someone who's programming if you're using your venue technicians, you've perhaps got someone who's programming the lights for you, whilst another person's running around in the venue, I don't know, adjusting and changing things. When it comes to actually going to the Q to Qs or just the programming, it's really essential, if that job, which it often is being shared between two technicians, so one's doing one day and one's doing the next, to make sure that they actually both stand there and watch how you do your cues as they go through them. Because what you can find is the first show looks great if it's the programmer who's programmed it to run all the cues, and then the next day it's really terrible because actually that technician hasn't been standing there watching it. And sod's law, that's the day that the Scotsman, big newspaper's critic, is coming in because you've done your first preview and you think you've got through it, and then it's not very good. So it's really important to make sure that if you are going to use the venue technician, that they both watch it. And as Bron was saying, sometimes you've got a lot of people who are learning the equipment as they're going along as well, which can create another layer of additional stress. So yes, if you can afford to bring a technician with you and you've got someone to talk to about how the show went afterwards and things, that can be also a really valuable, you know, point of call. But yeah, the technician could really make it or break it for you sometimes in a venue. So certainly making sure that they are present when you're there and watching what's going on with the techs and the setup, particularly with the queuing, if they're going to be operating for you, is really important.
I'm going to move on to audiences and marketing, because I think, you know, we've still got quite a bit to sort of cover, I think, and it's really, you brought up before about the patterns and the relationship that audiences have with Edinburgh, which is different to other festivals. People can go and see a show at 10 a.m. and it would be packed, versus a show at, you know, 7 p.m, which might be alongside other shows, which is more difficult to find an audience. And I think, you know, understanding the audience and marketing sort of aspect of Edinburgh in itself is a really big consideration to sort of interrogate, and one which, you know, can be something you learn along the way over many years and many repetitions. But I wonder, you know, whether we can maybe just sort of get your interpretation of like what you sort of consider to be the best way of making an impact in a program so big with in relation to audiences and marketing. Deb, do you want to start?
That's a really, really good question, and a really, really hard question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I guess getting yourself into the right venue is going to help if you with audiences, if that's the sort of work that you're presenting is the one that they are going to like. And the marketing part of it, I think, is making sure that your budget is big enough, or you're on the ground enough to sort of get out there and make yourself seen. That's one of the hardest things, I think, is being seen and standing out from everybody else. we get into the stars, like as soon as reviews come out, we make sure we get the stars up on posters and things like that, and make them big and large and colorful so that people see them, and audiences actually are drawn to your poster by the additional stars that you're getting. And last year I was out doing that, and I had a lady come up to me and say that's the only way she chooses a show, is she looks at the stars on the poster, and that's how she does it, because there's so much to see. I don't think there's any, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, Richard and Bron, but I don't think there's any sort of secret formula. I think you just don't know what show is going to land you, you know, a really good Edinburgh. But I think that if you've gone through your marketing plan, you've got your advertising, you've got your flyers, if you've got some PR, if possible, if you're able to afford a publicist. So you've kind of gone across a whole bunch of different ways of attracting or reaching different people. The flyering is important as well. And whilst we can employ flyers, I think that audience members really love to engage with the artist. And that's where it gets hard, because, you know, you've got a whole month of Edinburgh doing a show and then flyering. So being really strategic about your flyering and how much time you do it, if you're going to do it yourself. But I do think you get a better buy-in from audiences if you're flyering rather than paying a flyer. But, you know, of course, everyone has to make that decision themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably say, you know, everything that Deb's brought up are all great points and all advice to take on board. If you're an independent artist or a small production, I would say really, really, really think about your publicity image, and spend as much money on the photography and the design as you can. Get it professionally shot, get it properly designed. My friends and I often play a game every year where we try and find the worst poster in Edinburgh, and there are always so many contenders. Like if you can find something that people will remember, not to toot my own horn, but last year, you know, the poster for Waterloo, I'd be flying and people say, oh, I've seen this image around. And that was said to me so often, because I really worked so hard on trying to find something that was going to stand out and that was going to be striking. So if you have a small budget, or if you know, and people will see your posters and flyers will get around, you can do poster distribution for not very much money, so you can get your posters out there and people do look at them. It's a walking city, so people walk past, they look at posters, they look at signposted stuff, they look at stuff on the side of venues. If you have a good image, that can really, really help. Also, TikTok, we're doing interventions into Edinburgh last year and doing a big push from their side about marketing. So if you are younger than me and understand TikTok, then do that, because I think that will only grow, and that it's a great way to get your marketing across, you know, out there and on the internet.
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's a walking city and it's a flyering city to some degree, more than other festivals, unlike Adelaide, which doesn't rely on so much on flyers. Edinburgh's the reverse to that. Richard, what's your thoughts on making an impact if you're considering Edinburgh? I mean, if you've not been before and you think, okay, like how can I make an impact to get the audiences in? Obviously, it's a huge question.
Well,
but
I mean, firstly, you're in a unique environment because you're in the one place where you can take advice from a complete stranger standing in a line going to see a show, and you'll go off and see that show blind because that other person has told you it's really good, which is really wonderful, actually, in a certain sense. I think with Edinburgh, you can actually come and spend an awful lot of money on marketing, and some of it will, it can be very glamorous and you can do lots of stuff, but actually that word of mouth is actually the real crucial nut to absolutely everything. And I think if you've not got a big budget, I think there's ways in which you can achieve that with thinking about it quite strategically. One is obviously looking carefully through the Fringe program before you get there, and maybe seeing if there's a synergy that your work, if it's a certain performance practice or type, might connect with another show that's perhaps playing at the Fringe, and maybe there's cross marketing. So if you're flyering, as Deb was saying, and being quite strategic about that, maybe that audience that's coming out, might be your target audience that's coming into another show and looking at that. It's the same as if you make a friend with an artist on that show and you find a commonality with each other, that maybe you plug their show at the end of your show and vice versa, which is always a really great way of going out and doing stuff. Certainly, I think stars can be quite powerful, but you can be rather overwhelming with stars as well. You know, you can start to get dizzy with the number you're seeing if there's lots of them on a poster. The most successful marketing technique that I've ever used in Edinburgh is one that cost me really no money whatsoever, but I was very interested in, I'd watched on TV about how people selling soap powder in the UK had started a campaign where if you sat at a bus stop, someone would sit at the bus stop all day long, and as people waited for the bus, there'd be a poster for the soap company behind them at the bus stop, and they start talking about the soap company to the people who were waiting there as they were waiting for the bus, as if they were just a regular person in the street. And of course, the people would get on the bus and they'd look like they were getting on the next bus, and off they'd go, and they'd do the whole thing again. So I started to wonder if I could apply the same thing to the Edinburgh Fringe. And so what I did was, all these venues have very long lines waiting to go into their shows. So I put some people into these lines that just moved around with different shows and started conversations with people about what have you seen? And someone would always loves to share what they've seen. And when they got to asking the same question back, they would mention one of the shows that I was involved with. And you'd start to get this ripple going down the whole line. And obviously as the line filtered off, they'd filter it and join into another show. So you can hit like 10 or 20 shows in a couple of hours doing it that way. And actually it was the cheapest piece of marketing, and I've done it every year since. It's been proved to be something that was really quite successful. And I think sometimes thinking quite creatively is an advantage. Bron's absolutely right. Your image, if someone wants to keep, I mean, the great test, someone likes the image and they want to keep the leaflet. Because if you're getting a stack of leaflets being handed to you, what makes you take it? And if it's a really nice photo, then perhaps you want to put it on your wall afterwards of your Edinburgh memory or something that's framed with that. So I think things like that, taking that real time to look at it, and as I say, I think maybe Bron, there should be a Fringe Award for worst leaflet created, because I think there is an element, if you can really see when you see them side by side what works and what doesn't work. So I think if you're coming up with marketing, look at other shows and look at in past fringes, why has that design worked? And not just in Edinburgh, but I mean across the entire sort of all performance. Why do I engage with that? How does that poster grab me? And bear in mind that you've got to grab someone in about 2 seconds. So they're walking by. What makes me stop and want to look at that? And so consequently, those things become really, really important, that really capture and bring in that market. I'd always say with the leaflet, print on, it doesn't cost any more. If you're going to produce a leaflet, print on the back as well as the front. So many of these shows have a blank background, and you sort of say, well, this is the point where you get a chance to tell someone about the show. My other great little tip I use a lot in Edinburgh is stickers. I find stickers can be really effective. So if people don't want to take leaflets, if you've got the right sort of show and the right vibe, creating a sticker that someone will put on their lapel, hopefully they'll walk around and wear that for the rest of the afternoon. So people are looking at the sticker that you're wearing. If it's got a great catchphrase, I did a show all about vampires a few years ago, and we did a sticker that was called Vampires Bite Theatre Critics. And everyone wanted that sticker. So again, if you've got something that connects that's a bit quirky, those sort of things can have an effect. I mean, Andy and I have just been at the Fitz Festival in Sibiu. One of the best bits of marketing there I thought that they did was they created leaflets that were fans. So basically it was very hot in Romania when we were there, but these fans, everyone sat in the audience fanning themselves. So actually, if you've got, again, the right show, people will hang on to something, because you want to create, obviously, a piece of marketing material if you're giving it out, people want to keep in their pocket and hang on to.
Yeah. Can I also just raise about audiences being presenters in venues and festivals, because using artist services to contact to find out who's actually coming to Edinburgh from as an international delegate that might be interested in programming or looking at your work is another, that's a different audience altogether, but very, very important one. And artist services are really great with helping you find those people and giving you the connections, and then you can make the contact.
Yeah,
they have a spreadsheet.
And also the same thing, Deb, I was going to say the same thing with audience, Deb, as well, that, if you've got a show that you think's got a particular thing, don't underestimate how big the local audience is at these fringes as well. The largest proportion of audience that comes to Edinburgh comes from Scotland, and particularly from Edinburgh. So if you've got something that maybe has a local theme, don't underestimate the power of being able to actually think about, can I approach those groups? Can I market directly into those groups? And just doing that bit of research that's out there, because actually the conversation, particularly, you know, maybe as an artist, or if you've got a circus work or a cabaret work, or you could even go into a masterclass or a workshop if it's young people that are sitting there. There's lots of different strands like that that can come out. But obviously those audiences can become very, very valuable as audiences to sell tickets to. So certainly just have a look at some of the programs and things that can that happen, that you think, again, there might be connections with the themes of your work that might really help you within the marketing of that.
And Bron, you were about to say something.
Oh no, just that all that marketing talk makes me just feel really tired. That's all.
Well, I think it's let's move on to the industry approach. I think, you know, Deb's just very briefly sort of brought that up, because you know, alongside the audiences, there's also it's a festival which attracts a huge amount of industry from all walks of the industry itself. But it can be quite difficult sometimes to identify and navigate who the industry and who to invite are. I just wondered sort of what your experiences are of approaching Edinburgh as an industry marketplace, and how you can utilize Edinburgh to that effect.
I think it also depends. If you're not based in the UK, it can also be quite difficult. I had people coming up to me and going, "Where are you based?" And when I said Australia, they're like, "Oh, you know, that the international touring costs, you know, bringing shows over can be quite prohibitive." If you're a comedian, I know lots of people, you know, go on, do stand-up shows, and they're much more mobile and easier to kind of be slotted in and presented in different contexts. I'm so circus is very different. I think, you know, the medium and the kind of scale again will impact how much ongoing kind of life the show might have. Yeah, and again, like making connections with presenters, they might have full programs after COVID. A lot of festival programs are full for a couple of years, and you might not want to wait around, or, you know, so I would say meeting people and having these people talking about your shows and recommending your shows is one thing, but the reality of then onward touring is perhaps another one, I would say.
And is the arts industry office within Edinburgh, in terms of helping and engaging you with the industry, is that something that, you know, a first timer can really utilize?
They have a spreadsheet, and, you know, they've got people's emails addresses, so you can send out those press releases and follow up the press releases and send out the comp invites and all that kind of stuff. You know, and presenters do come and see work, and, you know, having them know about your work perhaps for future opportunity, you never know. Again, you never know who's in the audience, but yeah, through the arts industry office, you can definitely get those lists of presenters. But they might be looking for something really specific as well, and be like, I really love the show, but I'm looking for a dance work, or I'm looking for a children's work, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And it's like you say, you don't know who's going to be in the audience. You know, it could be that Sally Cowling from Brighton. Deb, did you want to add anything to the industry sort of connections that you can make in Edinburgh and things to consider?
I find it, you know, it's not the be all and end all, but I find it quite good. I tend to focus on starting relationships rather than selling a show. So whilst that's the reason that we're there, and, you know, we'd love to just get straight in and try and sell a show, that's not the reality. So I think I've got a number of connections that I see every year in Edinburgh, and we keep in touch throughout the year, just talking about things. They'll just contact and see what's going on in Australia, or vice versa. So I found that to be quite valuable, to be honest. And we're in Canada. We've got a show in Canada at the moment. And that came about through just, you know, casual relationships that we started in Edinburgh and developed into this year, taking, you know, a show on a 2-month tour. So that's been that has helped. It doesn't happen. We took 10 shows and not all of them got touring by any stretch of the imagination.
That's a good point, that it is a long game, and that, you know, you are to start relationships. And so I think maybe managing expectations about that, like it might take 3 or 4 years for that presenter to kind of then go, oh, I've got this new context, or I've got this festival that would work in. So, you know, and seeing people over a number of years, if you keep going back, is always, you know, personal relationships are always the best way to kind of get
and
on.
I think too, helping artists manage the expectation, that's what I find my job is a lot of the time is, oh, we might not get a tour this year. Well, why didn't we get a tour this year? We should have got a tour this year. I'm really disappointed. And okay, well, we'll try next year. And but we've got other things, again, focusing on the strategy of why they're there, or why they're doing what they're doing, so that we can still keep moving forward and heading towards the goals, but at the same time, not give up and you know, go and make a new work and forget about that work because it didn't work the first time. Someone said that before, and I've seen that happen, and that's such a shame. If you just, it's just hard because it is a long game. It really is a long game. It's frustrating.
I'm going to talk about health and well-being next, but I want to get your perspective on how industry approach Edinburgh versus other festival models, Richard. Like, have you found Edinburgh a place to identify new works and creatives over the years? Is it still a place?
I mean, I think as Bron and Debbie both said, you know, it's like it's often the start of a conversation. I mean, you know, deals don't really get done in Edinburgh, and no deal should really get done in the back of a pub anyway. It should be being sort of sat down and figured through where it comes through. I just wanted to pick one point up, which we were just talking about there, that I think is important, is there's a lot of onus that's put all the time on networking, and actually networking can be quite intimidating and quite difficult to do. So it's not something, I'm a bit shy. It's not something I've ever found particularly easy always. And I think you can get towards the end of it. It's a bit like Facebook friends, where people are walking around with huge clutches of business cards at some of these events. And you can feel very demoralized if you've only got 3 or 4 business cards in your hand and someone else is walking around like 20 cards. Again, it comes back to who's in the room. If it's 3 really good business cards, it can be really, really valuable to you. And I think there's an art to networking sometimes that's really important to think about. It's about, you know, being a friend, not a stalker, which I think is sometimes the particular balance of how you deal with that stuff. It's also being generous about it, that if someone's talking to you and saying, you know, I don't think that work is necessarily my work, this is what I'm looking for. If you've seen a work that you really connected with, actually saying to them, yeah, okay, well, you might be really interested in this particular work, because actually sometimes people remember those things in a certain way. I'd certainly say at those sort of networking events, it's really good to also have a notebook or something that keeps a track of who you were talking to. So even each day through the fringe, so you can just follow it up. So at the end, you're not trying to remember what happened on day 1 and you're now at day 27. The other thing about it, I would also say, is just to think about a business card or something that you can give with information. The best business card I think I've ever been given at any fringe anywhere is one where they gave me the business card, and on the back it said, "We met at," and the person wrote on the back of the business card where we met. The other note I would give about shows and performances, just purely from an industry standpoint, is, and it's something that hardly ever gets done as much as it should, is that there's often never any kind of program produced in terms of a free sheet or something when you come to watch the show. So if I go and watch, let's say, I mean, last Edinburgh, I think I saw something like 102 productions across the course of the Fringe last year, partly because I was also writing for the stage, but also from my own interest. At the end of it, when I come back to look at the shows that I remember I've engaged with, if there's a program which has got some biographical information that tells you something about the artist, all those things can be really important to come back and look at. And also because you as an artist or a company or someone is coming, is making a front-end investment to be there. So you are looking at building that conversation, that journey, that relationship. But obviously people need to know about you. So actually you can come back, you know, 2 months, 3 months later and have that conversation. And I sometimes get really sad that at the end of the Fringe, often some of those shows just disappear into the ether and you never hear of them again, but you've got no way of necessarily come back and contacting people. So I'd say, you know, obviously how you position yourself, the networking, how you go into those environments, but don't feel demoralized if you've come away and you don't feel you've spoken to as many people as the person next to you is claiming to have done, if you've got those relationships, and just be quite targeted in it. And as I say, it's the start of a conversation. And as Deb and Bron was saying, it goes over a period of time, and relationships, like anything, grow over that time, and they come about trust and relationship and collaboration. And is this a fit of someone and people that we think we can work together? And that's and it may not be on that work, it might be actually through the program that you've issued. They say, wow, this piece is really interesting, let's see what this writer or this artist is doing next. And so it starts to keep growing as that work continues.
I remember being at my very first Asian, or was Pam's in Seoul years ago, and I was totally overwhelmed. I had never been to an arts market before. And Fiona Winning from the Sydney Opera House said to me, Deb, if you can get 3 to 4 good connections out of this week, that's a successful Pam's. And I was thinking, oh, I need to talk to everybody, and that really centered me and helped me, just calmed me down, that advice. And it's true.
Also, being good at drinking wine helps as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But
never ever get into those conversations when you've had too much to drink, because that can also be pretty dangerous, again, because it's about how you get sometimes remembered. So enjoy the wine, but get the balance to it right as well. Absolutely.
I feel like we've come back to a very good sort of point of like understanding your whys and goals, and making sure those goals aren't unattainable. So like you say, come away from Edinburgh, I want to meet 4 new people, or I want to engage, I want to have a house between 6 and 15 people a night or something. The average of an Edinburgh audience, I want to fly for 2 hours, but I also want to take a walk, and get some fresh air. And I think, in terms of like Edinburgh, but also festivals as well, it can be very, very hard on your health and well-being, and approaching a festival and understanding what you need to do to take care of yourself is also really, really important in terms of considering something like Edinburgh, even more so. So yeah, I think health and well-being, I think, is something we should really sort of talk about here. Obviously, I just want to get your perspectives as people that have done seasons in Edinburgh as to what you think are important things to remember and consider about looking after yourself. Like, what should you do while you're there for a month, exactly, that you might not think about. Bron, how about you? I know you had I'm not picking on you here. I can leave you for later, but
no, I think it's funny you say it's a marathon, not a sprint, because I think that should be the kind of motto of the month. Trying to find fresh food in Scotland can also be a challenge. I heard a good thing from Felicity Ward talking about tips for Edinburgh, and saying when you get there, she does a Sainsbury's or a Tesco online order that arrives at her accommodation. So she has food, and she's sort of set up from the start. Trying to develop a bit of a routine. If your show's at 4:00, try and have lunch at a time, maybe at 11 or 12, and then you know that you've eaten something, and like really basic stuff where low blood sugar can just fuck you up. So like eating something with low GI can change your whole world for a day. Often it's like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm feeling this way because I haven't drunk any water, because I haven't had something to eat. So that these really basic things can really make a huge difference to your kind of well-being and sense of being able to cope over the month. I found on a practical level, snacks or things that don't take much preparation, that you can kind of like small things that you can eat easily when you might come home late, or because the thought of preparing something is too overwhelming. So having kind of fruit or snacks or little kind of things that you can eat that are easy, and like don't, I know it's boring, but don't drink too much, don't go out too much. No one cares if you don't go to the party. You're there to do a job, and you can't do your job if you're perpetually hungover. And that is a hard learnt lesson, but it is a good one. So have a pint, have a couple of pints, maybe alternate every few days, have a kind of bit of a drink. But if you're, it's just going to be too hard. especially if
And
you're like me.
there's some beautiful landmarks on your doorstep. I used to go for a partial walk up Arthur's Seat. I never got all the way up because it's too far and too windy, but it's literally on the doorstep of the city, but it just takes you out of the hustle and bustle of Edinburgh. And there's many little places you can kind of capture normality.
I was staying down at Haymarket, and even near Haymarket Station, you were practically outside of the festival hub, and it just, it was like a bit of having a breather from the intensity. I mean, Scotland's beautiful. Go to Glasgow on the train, it takes an hour. It's great.
Yeah.
I hop on the train and go 15 minutes just down the line to Portobello and just have a walk by the sea. And I think actually it's one of the great things about sometimes just stepping away. I mean, apart from the last day of the Fringe, it's always remembering that the whole thing is all going to repeat itself the next day. So if you don't want to do that evening, don't worry. It's all going to be the same thing going on the next day all over again. And actually stepping away from it and stepping back. It's like if you live in a big city, if you go away from it and come back, you appreciate it more. And I think it can also be really important because it is an intense vacuum that can actually become this bubble. But you really realize it's actually really only a bubble that's about, 3 or 4 square miles in one city. Outside of that, it's like life is normal in elsewhere. So actually just stepping out of normality and stepping back into normality and stepping back in again can be really, really helpful. And I think going sometimes to see other people's work is really great. It's good to get that balance of when you're doing that and when you feel like doing that. And I think, Bron, you hit a really important thing, because often you can't get into the venue yourself until 20 minutes before the show. The routine of how you prep for a show, often in any other environment, if you were going and turning up to do the show that evening, you'd perhaps get to the theatre, in the afternoon, you'd have that time in the dressing room, just mentally getting in. I think it's really important to just try and think about how you have your routine of setting up and the preparation of doing that. It can be very hard if you're in a venue like somewhere like the Travis, where shows don't play at the same time every day, because it can really throw you into a kilter of rhythm. But the performance practice going through into getting ready for the show becomes really important, and actually finding a place somewhere in the city which allows you to do that, even if it's just sitting quietly in a cafe in a corner, but that becomes your seat in that cafe where you go an hour before you come to the show and have a cup of tea or something and then come to. I think it really affects the whole rhythm of actually how your show is going to work on that particular day. And I think those little spaces and those fan spaces and how you do that become really, really important. And remember to breathe in Edinburgh, because that's awesome.
Yeah, and there are dressing rooms. Like I always that's one thing I do negotiate. I'm like, because my presets are so long, I'm like, I need a space. And like lots of places do have a space. It might be small, but they will have dressing rooms and things, so you will have that space.
And how about you, Debs? Anything adds in terms of looking after your mental health and well-being?
Last year, just for the first time, we negotiated with a gym because we had so many artists going over a pretty good rate for the month, of which I joined as well. And they had a beautiful indoor heated swimming pool, and so I went there nearly every day and had a swim in the morning, and then they had a cafe there, so I had a cup of coffee, my breakfast. So it was a really nice way to start the day, and then I got dressed and went off and did my job. So that, I think I'm going to do that again this year. It was really nice.
Sounds great. Yeah.
I guess like my last sort of question really is a bit of a biggie and an important one. It's budget and accommodation. Like you have to really think about. It's maybe a little bit boring, but it's also really important. I think, people not necessarily understand the competitive capitalist nature of Edinburgh and the accommodation scene there. So like what, in terms of if you're thinking of taking your work over to Edinburgh, say next year, like what should you really sort of potentially budget for? And like, how would you approach finding accommodation that's suitable for your needs?
Well, this year we had bought. Last year was really, really, really expensive, and it looked like it was going to be the same this year. Assembly, though, have gotten hold of a whole bunch of university accommodation, and so they have rented that out at £40 a night. So one of our clients or one of our companies went from an accommodation bill of $30,000 for 6 people down to just over 10,000. So that made a huge difference. But even $10,000 per month is a lot of money. And so that's about the cheapest she could get it at, you know, just for the sheer number of days and the number of artists. One of the things that we do with our artists is submit an export market development grant through Austrade. So last year we did 12 of them. And then this year everyone's on their on Austrade. So it's a grant that you can use for exporting your show. So we kind of talk to the artists about being exporters, and you can claim up to 50% of your grant back. So there's no criteria other than if you qualify, you qualify. You don't actually, everyone gets it, so to speak. So then you can claim that for accommodation costs, anything costs you to market and sell your show in Edinburgh. Can't claim it for wages, but you can claim it for your marketing, your travel, your accommodation and things like that. And that's through Austrade. So a lot of artists don't use it. They don't see themselves as exporters, but we've had 100% success rate with it. So it's been a big boost in helping artists get there.
Yeah, it is full on. It's pretty full on, and it's gotten more full on. I know that the Edinburgh City Council are trying to put stipulations in place to try to stop price gouging and try to stop landlords from really exploiting and just overcharging. I was seeing things on Twitter this year where it was like 30 or 40 grand. I saw one that was like 100 grand for the month. It was just out of control. Staying a little bit further out if you can, like Glasgow, Leith, you know, I think if you're Australian, you think about distance differently, and a 20-minute bus ride to us is not that big a deal. So that could be an option. I used a website called Theatre Digs Booker, which was fantastic and cost me £600 for the month, but that was extremely lucky. And so, you know, sharing costs, you hear those stories about, you know, 4 people to a room, which doesn't sound like a great way to kind of spend a month. But yeah, accommodation is really, it's a really hard one. So yeah, again, talk to other people who have been, maybe they have an ongoing relationship with a landlord or a house or university accommodation. Deb, I've heard of other artists using that as well. Yeah, there are no easy fixes for that one, unfortunately.
I think undoubtedly it's a really big challenge, and it is something you've got to think about really carefully, because it does determine your decision of coming. Because of course that idea, when you convince yourself it'll be okay to spend the whole time staying in a hostel because that seemed like a good idea when you first got there and it's going to save money, actually doesn't necessarily turn into be the great environment as time goes on. But you know, there are sources like the Edinburgh Fringe Society has a sort of accommodation forum on there and things, and undoubtedly it's the biggest challenge that the fringe faces. But I think, as I say, you do have to come at it also with a pragmatic responsibility that, as exciting as it is to be there, is this the viable cost to be able to come to make me do it? And you know, like you can say, well, this is only costing me £2,000, but £2,000 is a lot of money if you haven't got £2,000 to start with. So it really is coming with your budget and figuring out that the value of coming to Edinburgh in this nature is going to serve what I need. And as I say, I mean, certainly there are different platforms. It really is valuable, I think, to talk sometimes to other people who've had those experiences, or if they've rented in a particular area. There's a lot of bogus accommodation as well, unfortunately, now through social medias there. So again, checking back with the Fringe Society, just asking, do you know anything? Has this person advertised before? Just making sure so you don't get any nasty surprises when you get there. And obviously, as Bron said, you don't have to stay right in the centre of Edinburgh. There's a very good train and bus network that gets you all over the city. And looking at those things in different ways can really make a sizable difference as to where you may choose to stay. But the environment of where you stay over those few weeks, be it yourself as an artist or a company, it can can really change the whole aesthetic of where you're going to come and stay. And certainly if you've got colleagues or friends who are also looking for accommodation and you think you can cope with spending, you know, a time staying with them as well in the same building, allowing yourself to have sufficient space. I think that's really important in a accommodation. You know, those are obviously great abilities to be able to save something and make some concession to making the trip to Edinburgh become enjoyable.
For sure. Yeah, I personally couldn't, you know, spend a month in a crazy share house and do the show and get enough sleep. And, you know, so everybody has their own kind of boundaries about what they will and won't put up with, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, we kind of reached really the sort of end of our time here, and I guess, yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic to kind of get to hear all of your perspectives and knowledge, and yeah, kind of the tips and considerations for taking work to Edinburgh. I think it's worth kind of ending on a note to basically, I guess, an air of positivity. I think, you know, Edinburgh is a wonderful place that's unique really to other festivals and fringes around the world. You know, it's a place where you can meet people and meet creatives that are like-minded, you know, see new works, experience a different city, you know, yeah, really sort of challenge yourself, whether that might be, you know, scarring and unhealthy to yourself at the end. It's certainly something that can be attributed to a testimonial to your life experience in some ways. And there's a lot of joy and positivity that comes out of Edinburgh sometimes as well. So yeah, you know, it's a really great place to consider taking your work, but also really do consider the whys and the parameters and what you're capable of. You know, leave yourself time to give yourself, you know, breathable spaces to eat, you know, to sleep, not to drink too much, you know. So there's lots of different things to consider. And I feel like we've tapped on a couple of things on those. And there's some great resources, as I say, through the Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society, through our team, talk to peers who've been to Edinburgh. There's lots of different ways of kind of interrogating the information and finding out the information you need. So I want to thank all of my panel speakers today. Just, you know, it's been wonderful for you to sort of generously share your time and experiences with us. So I want to thank Bron Batten, Deb Wilkes, and Richard Jordan for speaking today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.